Hi, everyone. Welcome to Happy to See Me, the podcast that puts the spotlight on the overlooked and underestimated. I'm Erika Casupanan, and this week I am speaking with comedian and artist Tranna Wintour. But first, I love to start each episode talking about something I was happy to see this week. And this week, I had two run-ins with people from my past. First, I ran into an old coworker. This is someone I worked with at the job that was the place I went to as an intern when I first finished school and then ended up working there for 5 years. And I ran into her at an event where now she's working at a company that totally fits her passions and what she's always wanted. And I was there as the quote unquote talent / influencer. And we were so thrilled to be able to catch up and talk about where we're at now. And I was so happy for her and she was so happy for me. Also, in that same week, I ran into an old friend who I used to box with. So if you remember an older episode of the podcast, it was episode 14. I spoke to Olympic boxer Mandy Bougeot. We talk about how I met Mandy because I had done a charity boxing tournament and Mandy was the coach. So the woman I ran into the other day, she was on my team during that charity boxing tournament. So she trained with Mandy as well. We used to be sparring partners, which meant that during practice, we were just always punching each other in the face. Of course, there was no aggression. There was no violence. It was all part of the sport. But you do really build a sense of trust with someone who you have to get into that type of activity with week after week. And it was like 3 times a week, we'd be sparring with each other. So we built so much trust and so much admiration for each other. And then when I ran into her on the street, that was the first time I'd seen her in, oh my gosh, almost 10 years. And I was thrilled to see her. We just hugged. We were so excited to see how the other person was doing. I was so happy for her. She was so supportive of me. Even the coworker I saw, I started working with her, oh my gosh, 12 years ago. The reason why I was so excited to see these people and why these meetings resonated with me so much. We all know, if you listen to this podcast, I love talking about growth. I love the journey of being able to step into more of the authentic version of myself. I've been fortunate. I've been able to share that with all of you over the last few years. With doing that, I find that sometimes it can be really easy to romanticize the present and romanticize the future, but then not quite give the past the credit that it deserves. And when I look back to the older versions of myself, she was figuring herself out, learning about herself, even though I think I will always be figuring myself and always learning about myself. She was loved and supported as who she was then. And seeing these people and seeing how excited I was to see them and how excited they were for me, I am also loved and supported for who I am now. The run-ins reminded me that on every step of the journey, there is always something to appreciate. You can be excited for the present and for the future and still have a deep appreciation for the past. So that is what I was happy to see this week. And speaking of growth and incredible journeys, I am very excited to share this conversation with Tranna Wintour. Tranna is a bilingual comedian, writer, hostess, performer, and producer. And she was on Quebec's version of Celebrity Big Brother 2 years ago. In this conversation, we are talking about coming into our queerness and our authentic selves as adults, managing the anxiety and learning to embrace the passion when it comes to working in creative industries, and the lessons she learned on Quebec's Celebrity Big Brother. This conversation has it all. There is heartfelt conversation, vulnerability, some laughs. I felt so inspired after this conversation. So if you know someone who is a comedy fan, a reality TV fan, or needs a push in their creative career, make sure you share this episode with them. So let's just get into it. Here is my interview with Tranna Wintour. I hope you enjoy it. I'm so excited to talk to you. One, we are both reality TV gals somehow.
We are.
And then I also just would love to learn so much more about your career because as a creative, you have touched so many mediums already. And I know that there are people who listen to this podcast and they're always interested in trying something new, or they might want to take the leap and do something, but they just need that extra push. And I feel like you might be the one who can give that extra push.
I am always willing to give that push. I'm someone who needs to be pushed as well, but I can also do the pushing.
I love that. The nonviolent loving pushing.
Always.
You said that you feel like you need the push sometimes. So
Yes.
when you were younger, did you always know that you wanted to be a performer, or did you need to find that push from somebody?
No, I always knew. It was just this energy that was so present and so natural from my earliest memories. I genuinely do not feel like it was something that I chose. I think it was just something that I had because I wouldn't choose this. I don't think that I would consciously choose the performer life. I do it because I don't have a choice. Like, it really just always felt like something that I was meant to do. But growing up, I never took it seriously in the sense that I never thought that you could actually be an artist or a performer. To me, it just seemed like a fantasy. It didn't seem like that was something that I could ever actually do. And I think that a big part of that as well had to do with, and I don't want to like start a whole sob story because it's not that, but I was bullied really badly when I was a kid, like from age 5 to 17. That made me so scared of being myself out loud. And I think that obviously that messed with my confidence. And I think that that definitely played into this feeling that I could never make my dreams come true.
That's something that I think so many people can relate to. And I had read in an older interview that you described yourself as wanting to be invisible when you were a kid, but then also knowing that you are naturally a showgirl. How did you decide to step from being invisible to now being the showgirl?
That's such a great question. And I think that that was the most important process that I ever embarked on because as a kid, I wanted to be invisible only as a means for survival. When you're bullied so young, like a 5-year-old is a baby, especially when I look back on it now. Obviously, I was so ill-equipped to deal with that as a kid, as all kids are. No kid is equipped to deal with bullying or hatred. So the only survival instinct or strategy that I had was just to become invisible so that if I wasn't seen, then I wouldn't be bullied. But as you pointed out, being invisible was also so in direct conflict with my natural showgirl performer energy. And I think that also related to that is my femininity and my identity as a trans person. And, for me, the bullying experience was really centered around my femaleness. Like, that's what got me bullied. My bullies, even more than calling me gay, they would just call me a girl as if that was like the worst thing a person could be. And I always had this innate sense of self, so I could never pretend to be something that I wasn't. I couldn't pretend to be like a straight cis dude. So I had to become invisible in order to protect myself, both the creative artist energy and my sort of natural female energy as well. And I think that for so long, that invisibility really disconnected me from my creative expression and the expression of my true identity. It was only in my like early 20s when I really came to an understanding of myself as a trans person, like having that knowledge, because I grew up in the 90s and there weren't these big mainstream discussions about gender identity. And there wasn't this kind of information that I had access to growing up. So I didn't even have the knowledge or vocabulary to be able to identify myself. But when I finally did have access to that information as a young adult, and then suddenly everything became sort of clear for me, it was like when I reconnected to or embraced my female identity, I was able to at the same time accept and express my artist identity. So for me, those two things were really related. And I had to really reconnect with both of them and connect both of those two things together before there was any hope of me ever actually performing and doing the work that I wanted to do.
Yeah, it sounds like it wasn't as simple as performing that was being held back by the way you were feeling, but it was just really like your expression of who you are overall.
Exactly.
And how old are you now?
I'm 37 now, but don't tell
Okay.
anyone.
So it's okay. I'm 34. We look so young. We're so
Thanks.
youthful. How old were you when you started to accept that you wanted to perform? You said you were in your 20s.
Yeah, so I was around 25, 26, I think, when I like finally did my first show. In the process leading up to that first show, again, like I had to find this confidence in myself before I could ever step on stage. And for me, that confidence was really derived from self-knowledge and self-understanding. And yeah, I don't think I could have ever gotten on stage without that beforehand.
You needed all of that together, truly. Did you present as feminine, or did you know that you were feminine when you were quite young?
Yeah, I mean, again, like as much as my performer and showgirl identity was so innate, so was my femininity. For me, it was just always there. It was always so natural. And thankfully at home, in my home life as a kid, like I grew up very luckily in a very like loving and embracing and accepting family. So I was always able to express that. But it was really in school where it was not really possible to express that. And again, I didn't try to like become some like tough boy. Like I could never be one of the boys. So I just retreated, you know? I mean, thankfully, I always had good friends too, like really good girlfriends in elementary school and high school. Outside of those friendships within school, like I was really just hiding.
I feel like I can relate to you in some way because I came out at the end of last year publicly.
Amazing, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. I had read that you had a normal, quote unquote, normal job working at a bank, and you left that job in your 20s. You also started performing in your 20s. You were able to understand your transness in your 20s.
Yeah.
Everyone knows that I had a normal job, and then I went on Survivor, got to change my life. And it was after all those life changes, I was just like, oh my God, I'm gay. And I don't know, there's something about once you just release what you think you're supposed to do, all of a sudden everything kind of comes undone. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, you said it so perfectly. There's something about that moment of illumination that suddenly changes everything and you can't go back. You know, once you've seen that light, like I'm gay or I'm trans, like once you understand that, you can't unsee it. And for me, it was actually, this was like, I guess like around 2010, 2011, I was reading Cher's son's memoir. So Cher has a trans son named Chaz, who was one of the first really public trans people. And he wrote this really great memoir. But I only bought his memoir because I wanted to hear stories about Cher. But when I, honestly, like that was my main draw to the book. But when I was reading his book, and there was this part in the book where he describes this time in his life where he was trying to live as like a cis female lesbian, and how even that never felt right. And it just sort of hit me like a ton of bricks reading that section in the book. And I was just like, oh my God, that's exactly what I've been doing as well. And then it was almost like my whole previous life just flashed before my eyes and suddenly everything just made sense.
Oh my God,
and then,
yes.
Yeah. And then from that moment onwards, things just got more and more aligned, because if you don't have an understanding of yourself, I think it's really hard to align yourself with your purpose, to find confidence. I think that self-knowledge is so foundational.
Yeah. And it is really freeing. For me, it was like a big sense of relief.
Yeah.
It's almost like you go back and you're recalibrating and reframing memories where you're like, oh my gosh, in those situations, I thought that I was so weird, or I thought that there was something wrong with me because I felt this way or didn't feel this way. And then you're like, whoa, it turns out I was perfectly fine the whole time. I just didn't know this about me.
Exactly. I mean, I couldn't say it any better. That's exactly what it is.
With the name Tranna Wintour,
Yeah.
When did that come into the picture?
Because there is this, for me, this real connection between my trans identity and my identity as an artist, and how those two things I sort of reconnected with and connected at the same time. So before I fully stepped into my transness, or however, I don't even know how to call that process, but for Halloween one year, I was dressed up as Anna Wintour. the editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine, who The Devil Wears Prada is based on. That same year, my friend went as a trans version of Justin Bieber. And this was when Justin Bieber had like first came out. And so my friend was sort of like, from the waist up, this like very Justin Bieber look, but then from the waist down was wearing like fishnets and heels. And that whole night, we just kept calling her Trans Bieber. And then I don't know how this came into my mind, but I was just like, well, if you're Trans Bieber, then I'm Tranna Wintour. And it just stuck. And again, because my sort of understanding of my transness and my identity as an artist happened at the same time, it's sort of like, I feel like I didn't even really choose the name. It just sort of came and it stuck, Whereas to be honest, if I could go back in time, I might have chosen something else because it's such a drag queen kind of name. And I'm not a drag queen. And I think that already for so many people, there's this confusion between drag and transness. And so like sometimes it can be a bit frustrating for me when people treat me or speak to me like I'm a drag queen and I'm playing a character, because I'm not playing a character at all. Even when I'm on stage, like, of course, I'm presenting a heightened version of who I am, but it is who I am. I'm not playing a character. So I feel like sometimes the name bothers me a little bit, but then also the name has really served me well. Like it grabs people's attention. Like I remember like years and years and years ago, like RuPaul started following me on Twitter because of the name. So like there's all these, it worked out the way that it worked out,
Yeah.
And I feel like I didn't even really choose the name. It just came about in this moment and just stuck.
Sometimes the name chooses you.
Yeah, exactly.
Is Tranna more of your performer name, or is that the name that you use in your day-to-day with your family and friends too?
Yeah, it's the name that I use day to day. Again, because those two things happened at the same time, I didn't really get to choose a like everyday life girl name. You know what I mean? Like it all happened at the same time. So they all just kind of became conflated. And then I just feel like now I'm just like, I don't really feel like having another name. You know? It's just too much of a hassle.
Most people only have one.
Most people only have one. And it's like, I already have a dead name. And now I have my real name, which is also my, artist name. And I'm like, I don't want an everyday name in addition to all of those things. It's too exhausting. This is how everyone already knows me. So I'm like, let's just keep it simple.
Yeah. Well, the name is consistent then on and off stage.
Yeah.
But do you feel like the Tranna who is on stage is the same as the Tranna who is off stage?
Pretty much, honestly. I think that for me, in my work as a comedian and the comedy that I tend to respond to, my favorite comedians do a very kind of personal and vulnerable kind of comedy. And so I feel like that authenticity and coming from a really personal place on stage is really important for me. So I would say pretty much who you see on stage is the real me in my everyday life. I would just say that the me on stage is obviously more confident and more sassy, but it's just a heightened version of me. It's like, it's all of what I think are my best qualities that just become heightened because I'm feeding off of an audience and I'm feeding off of an energy that fuels me. So it's sort of, it takes me to the next level. Whereas obviously in my everyday life, there's not an audience watching me. But I would say that's really the only difference.
Totally. And once you're on the stage and the lights are on you, you have to rise to those heights.
Exactly. You have to rise to those heights. But also at the same time, though, I feel so at home on stage. Like, to be honest, on stage is probably where I feel or not the most safe, but among the most safe. Like, I don't know. There's something about that energy and that connection with an audience that just makes me feel so protected. And I think that that feeling of safety on stage is what allows me to really express without any sort of holding back.
And is there an element of you've always known this is where you were supposed to be? Since you were that kid who wanted to perform, it's like you're home on stage.
Well, I didn't know that it would feel that way because I think that before I started doing it, even though it was something that was so innate and something that I desired so profoundly, I think that I was also very scared of it and very intimidated by it. So I didn't know that it would feel like home, honestly. I knew that it was what I was meant to do. And again, especially at that moment where I came to this understanding of my trans identity and then reconnected with my artist spirit, I knew from that moment of illumination, even before I stepped foot on a stage, I just knew that that was it. Because again, I've really always known, but you can't fully know 110% until you actually do it. And I think that, one of the things that I learned and that I try to pass on to other people who are, ready to start doing the thing that they've always wanted to do, but have maybe been too scared to do, is that you're never going to feel 100% ready. Never. I think that I was trying to feel 100% ready, but you never will. And the fear will never go away. There's nothing you can do to take away the fear. You just have to walk through it. And then when you do, you realize that it's not so bad and that it's so worth it.
That is so comforting, especially because you've been doing stand-up and you've been performing forever. So if somebody is a beginner and they feel scared, there's always going to be that fear no matter how much experience you have, and it's okay.
Exactly. And it's totally okay. And again, there's no amount of preparation that you can do that's going to take the fear away. So at a certain point, you just have to accept and embrace the fear and use it as a sort of fuel or force behind you and just walk through it.
Knowing that there are so many mediums that you can do on stage, what drew you to getting started with stand-up in particular?
That's a really good question because honestly, I never grew up with the idea of stand-up. I always knew that I had this performer energy, but I never knew that stand-up would be the sort of predominant shape that it would take. Because growing up, the kind of performance and art that excited and inspired me the most was really music. Like my first love was Alanis Morissette and Jagged Little Pill and that album. And this idea of like self-expression, I really feel like she was the first example for me of like what it means to be an artist and what it means to self-express through art. It was really her. And that's what I really wanted. And even today, I can't lie, I did record an album like a couple of years ago. So and I do incorporate music into my show, but comedy really, when I discovered most notably Margaret Cho and Sandra Bernhard, two comedians that I love. Margaret, I discovered more in my teens and Sandra a little bit later, although I always had a sense of who she was. But it was really when I looked at their work that it was like, oh my God, I think this is what I've been looking for my whole life. Because as much as I loved music, I don't play any instruments. I can't compose music. I'm more of like an interpreter. And while I love acting, that never really felt like it either. So I was always in search of what would my mode of expression be. And again, when I sort of landed on these two women and saw their work, it was another one of those like epiphany moments. And I'm like, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for my whole life. But in general, I was never a general fan of stand-up growing up. Like it wasn't really something that I consumed a lot of. And even now I have to say, it's not necessarily my favorite thing to watch. I love doing it because I think that I see it really fundamentally just as storytelling, And I think that ultimately, whether it's music or stand-up or any kind of sort of artistic expression, it's fundamentally storytelling.
Yeah, I used to hate stand-up, but then during the pandemic, I took all these online comedy classes and I'm like, why not take a stand-up class? And the instructor on the first day asked everyone to go around and say who their favorite stand-up was. So they get to me and I'm like, I don't have a favorite. I don't really like stand-up. And he was like, why don't you like stand-up? And I'm like, it's always just some guy talking. And then he laughed. He's like, I've never heard someone so swiftly just discredit my life's work, but that's fine. But honestly, I was like, oh, whenever I would see stand-up as a medium, it was always just some straight white guy talking.
Me too, subconsciously. Like, I think growing up, like, I didn't even think about it consciously, but I think that I was just subconsciously or just very naturally turned off, And even to this day, to be honest, like, I mean, I have a lot of people that come up to me after shows. I mean, mostly women and queer people that will come up to me and say, I never felt like stand-up could be for me. I never felt like that it was something that I could experience or like derive joy from. But, now I think that there's such a strong queer presence in comedy. And I think that that's where a lot of the best comedy is happening. Like, I won't even say that apologetically. I think that's just the truth. I think that there are audiences now finding their way to comedy and experiencing it in ways that they never thought possible, which is amazing.
I was reading an interview you did. It was maybe almost 10 years ago now. And in the interview, it seemed like you were explaining what it meant to be trans. So you got started years ago. What role did your transness play in your comedy then? And do you feel like it's evolved now?
For sure. I think so I started about 11 years ago. So 2013. At the time when I started, at least in Montreal, but I think even more broadly, there were really either very few or none at all of comedy shows that would either showcase exclusively female lineups or queer lineups. That was not something that I had access to. I mean, I have to say I was very lucky. I was surrounded by really great people, and even the sort of more bro-y straight male comedians were always pretty nice to me, you know? I think a lot of them didn't necessarily take me seriously or felt that my style of comedy wasn't real comedy, whatever that's supposed to mean. But I never had any truly horrible experiences with other comedians. But I think that at the time, it was if I didn't start my performance by talking about being trans, then people would they would try to figure me out, or they'd be confused by me. And that would take away from them just listening to my jokes and really just being in it with me. And to be honest, that's something that hasn't really changed for straight cis audiences. If I'm performing somewhere where I get the sense that the audience is maybe a little bit more conservative or just a bit more, normative in their thinking, I still feel like I kind of have to start my set off by sort of announcing my transness and addressing it at the top, because if I don't, again, they don't really get me, because unfortunately, I think a lot of people need to be able to fit people into boxes, and that's the only way that they can be comfortable with people, which I think is such a shame because that's so boring. And I think that there's so much magic in the ambiguous. And I don't understand this need to have everyone figured out. I just don't get that. So that hasn't changed that much. But the biggest thing, again, that has changed is just that now there is this really thriving sort of subculture of comedy that is being led by queer people and women and feminists. There's so much more there in the comedy world, and thank God.
Yeah, now more people have the opportunity to really see themselves in the medium, and they know it's not just some guy talking to them.
Exactly. I'm so grateful because, again, when I started, that scene didn't exist in the way that it does now. We just, as queer or marginalized people, we had to just sort of insert ourselves into these spaces and try to take up space. And, again, for me, it mostly always went super well, but it was tough. It was tough. Even if I was just on stage for 5 minutes back in those days, I would really treat those 5 minutes as if it was an entire show. I would take my time on that stage so seriously. And I would be like, you know what? For these 5 minutes, the audience is mine, and I want to give them everything that I can possibly give them, And I think that's because I grew up idolizing these pop icons who put on a fucking show and dazzle people. Comedy is not always very glamorous, but I've always wanted to bring some kind of feeling of spectacle to what I do as well, because it's I want to entertain.
Yeah, and I've seen that you've been able to work on other mediums besides comedy. So you've been able to grow into music, into podcasting, into more TV. When did you know that it was time for you creatively to start to explore these new mediums?
I think I kind of always did a little bit of everything at the same time. For sure, was more predominantly comedy at the beginning, but I think that was just very natural for me. Again, so many of the artists that I grew up idolizing, like Madonna and Cher and Barbara Streisand, these are all women who do so many different things. And so I think that I just grew up with the idea that an artist does all kinds of things. And I think that I also just have so many different interests. And I think that especially when you're an independent artist who's making or trying to make a living off of your work, you have to diversify if you can. When the pandemic hit, for example, and then I could no longer perform, thank God I had other things that I could do. So I think if the interest is there, I think diversifying is always a really great thing. And also, as much as I love comedy, I don't even think that it's comedy per se. I think it's what I truly love is being on stage and exchanging with an audience. It's the exchange that I live for. It's not necessarily comedy that I live for, even though that's the form that it takes. It's
Mm-hmm.
the exchange of energy and this like magical communication that happens with an audience that just lights me up. And that is what I live for. And if I could make a living just performing, that would be a dream, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But I also love screenwriting and podcasting and interviewing, and I love all of those things too. So it's just like, why limit myself?
I've never heard anyone describe being on stage like that. And I think it's so beautiful where it's not just you saying what you want to say, but it is really that relationship that you're building with the audience.
1,000%. Like, and I think you can tell the difference between a performer who's just up there for this sort of ego gratification and they're just taking,
Mm-hmm.
like they're sort of occupying their space to just say what they want to say. And it doesn't even really matter. The audience doesn't even really matter. And they're just there to sort of like take that energy. But for me, it's really about, of course, receiving it, but literally sending it back, and like, even though we're not having a verbal dialogue, it is still a conversation that I'm having with an audience. And I love, and I try, even when I'm on a big stage, and I actually like smaller stages and smaller rooms better because I live for that intimacy. For me, that's truly what it's all about.
Yeah. And that's how you build your career and you build an audience through building that connection.
I think so. I think that, like, especially now in this insane digital age that we live in, which can be amazing in so many ways, but then also so cold and so inhumane in other ways. I don't think anything can really replace that human face to face, energy to energy, soul to soul experience. I think that fundamentally there is something so magical about live performance, whether it's comedy or music or theater. I think that it's so precious because I think that it's the ultimate reflection of the human experience.
Oh, totally agree. And I want to go back to what you were saying about diversification as a creative, because as I mentioned before, I had a job, and then now I do all of the things I do now, and I encounter so many more creative people. And what's interesting is I think that there's almost like this push and pull between the feeling of abundance and knowing that you can work on all sorts of projects, all sorts of mediums, but then also that feeling of scarcity and feeling like you have to do so many things to try to cobble together enough money to make a living.
Yeah.
Do you experience that? And then how do you kind of work through that?
I think it's my biggest struggle, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you summed it up so perfectly. It's something that I think about a lot. I talk about this a lot with my fellow indie artist friends who are also trying to make a living in a very unstable environment. Although now we're living in a moment where everyone's jobs are unstable. There's so little security in the world to be found. And there is very little to be found in the world of the arts. It's so unpredictable. And I think that that's one of my biggest struggles, is that I'm someone who craves security. And I guess we all do to a certain extent, but I really do. It's like my mind knows that I am not going to find this feeling of security in the arts, but it's like my heart still is trying to find it. And I don't know when I'm finally going to get it through to myself that part of being an artist is accepting the risk, is accepting the fear, is accepting the anxiety that comes with, am I going to be able to pay my rent next month? Like, will I be able to line up enough gigs to support myself? It's terrifying. And I have to admit, like, I live with a lot of stress and anxiety. I think part of that is because I did not grow up in a wealthy family. There is no one for me to rely on financially other than myself. I don't have anything or anyone else to fall back on in a financial sense, so that's all on me. I'm single, so I don't have someone splitting half of the life costs with me either. So it's extremely terrifying. And to be honest, I don't think that I have fully arrived at any kind of peace or chill with that. I live with that stress and anxiety. And I think the thing that gets me through is just the unbelievable joy that I experience when I'm on stage or when I get to create something that works out, that fulfills me. It makes all of those hours of stress and anxiety worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember when I did used to work at a bank and when I did have that regular day job and how miserable I was, regardless of how scary it can be, it is worth it. I have to constantly recommit to trusting in myself and in the sort of universe, as woo woo as that might sound. I think that you have to trust in your purpose and trust in yourself. And again, there are moments of self-doubt. Like, I think I go through a sort of existential crisis once a year where I feel like this is not working. I can't deal with this anymore. It's time to find something else. But that's just my, to quote RuPaul, that's just my inner saboteur speaking, because I know that I'm aligned with my purpose, So when I have to, I take the time to reconnect to myself.
Yeah.
And to be honest, even though we shouldn't need outside validation, and I don't think that I necessarily need it, but when I do have people either messaging me or coming up to me in person and telling me that what I do means something to them, that fuels me. That bolsters and strengthens my belief in myself and reminds me that what I'm doing has value and is worthwhile. I think it's important to reach out to your favorite artists from time to time and let them know that their work means something to you, because I think we all sort of need those little boosts from time to time, because it's hard to derive validation 100% from ourselves 100% of the time.
Yes. I've had so many creative people tell me that advice where they're like, it feels so good to get that random piece of validation. So if there's anybody that you admire, reach out to them and just let them know. So I've gotten into the habit of, if I've consumed something I like, if somebody makes something I like, I'll DM them and tell them I like it.
Me too.
Sometimes I don't hear back, but it's more about the action of doing it.
Exactly. I had this insane experience 2 years ago where I got to meet Alanis, who was again, the first artist that just opened up my little kid life, wide open. Her music has genuinely been the soundtrack to my life, not just Jagged Little Pill, but everything that came after. And I just always had this need to thank her. It was important to me to be able to thank her. And it was so magical to be able to do that, because it's that exchange. I just think gratitude is just so important.
Oh, yeah. And especially in this world, if there's so much to be nervous about, anxious about, and you're doing it for that connection and for that feeling, go fucking tell somebody that you appreciate the way that they made you feel.
Even sometimes, this might sound so ridiculous, but even sometimes in my moments of doubt, I'll go back to some of those messages that people sent me or comments that people left me and reread them, and they do lift me up, honestly.
Same. So if anyone is listening, send a nice message to someone, preferably us, but you can send it to anybody. Now, I would love to ask you about your Celebrity Big Brother experience. And if there's anybody who's listening who is not from Canada, I'll give you the context. Quebec is a French-speaking province in Canada. They have their own bustling star system, and Tranna was on Celebrity Big Brother 2 years ago. So going into this, number one, how did this come about? And were you a reality TV fan before?
I'm a reality TV fan, but I like more competition-based shows like The Great British Bake Off and Blown Away. Anything that's about a sort of craft. I really love those kinds of reality TV shows. And when I was a kid and Survivor premiered, I was obsessed with the first 2 seasons when I was a kid. And then I kind of dropped off a little bit. But then also during the pandemic, I got sucked back into Survivor because I have a couple of friends who are really obsessed with it. And Survivor really does have, as I'm obviously, does have this sort of subculture of queer following.
Yes.
That's so fascinating to me. And honestly, like during the pandemic, when I kind of ran out of things to watch, I started watching old seasons of Survivor and it just sucked me right back in. So like, even though I don't necessarily consume a lot of reality TV, I can get sucked in very easily. And I'm loving The Traitors right now. It's so much fun. And the way that it came about for me was really crazy because I don't know if you know Rita Baga, the drag queen who was
Yes.
on Canada's Drag Race, the first season, who's amazing and is like such a big star here in Quebec. And she was on the first season of Quebec's Celebrity Big Brother. And because of the sort of spotlight that was put on her because of that, she hosted a Just for Laughs gala on the French side. And she co-hosted it with the winner of her Big Brother season, who's also a great comedian. So they got to host this gala sort of as a result of their like Big Brother celebrity. And Rita asked me to perform on that gala. So I did. And very naively, I swear to you, sometimes I have these moments of total like naive thinking. It didn't even occur to me that people from the Big Brother production would be at the show to watch their people.
Mm-hmm.
And I had made this joke at the end of my set that was sort of like a wink to Rita. And I was sort of elaborating this plan to become like a Quebec celebrity in Quebec's star system. So I was just like, listing this plan. And the last step of my plan to become Quebec famous was to do Celebrity Big Brother. But I was just saying it as a joke. Like I had no intention or even thought of ever actually doing it. But the producers of the show were there. And then like a week later, they reached out to me and they just asked me to be on it.
Wow.
And it was crazy. And I was just like, okay, like, what are the next steps? Like, what is the audition process like? And they were like, no, there's no audition. Like, you either say yes or you say no. Up until that point, like, I had been hustling as an independent artist on the underground for 8 years. I had never been given this opportunity for mainstream visibility. Because I didn't really want to do Big Brother. The idea of it scared me to my core. Like, I have never been more scared of anything in my life. I did not want to do it. But I knew that I could not pass up this opportunity. Again, after being on the underground scene for so long, and I'm being handed this opportunity in the mainstream, I'm just like, I have to say yes, even though I want to say no.
I mean, that's how I heard of you. Somebody requested that I interview you because they saw you on Celebrity Big Brother. So, I mean, it worked and now we're talking.
Yeah, it worked. It worked.
With that experience, I know that there's so many things we can talk about when it comes to reality TV. What I'm always most curious about is, what did you learn about yourself after you got out of the house?
Oh my God, you're so good, honestly.
Oh,
like,
thank
you
you.
have the best question. Okay, so my answer to your question was actually my biggest surprise. Because I was so terrified of going into this experience because, first of all, like as a trans person, there's so much scrutiny about our appearance. You know what I mean? And I was just, I was scared of that. I'm like, I can't be this like femme glamazon 24/7. Like that's just not possible, So I was scared of that. I was scared of like how people were going to perceive me and understand my gender identity. And I was scared that I would be in a house with only cisgender straight people who would like be misgendering me constantly. I'm like, I don't want to live my everyday life with people that are like misgendering me at all times of the day. And then I was scared of like, what if I'm in this like high school situation all over again where I'm like bullied or feel insecure? And like, I was just terrified of all of it, And then literally the first day, we all connected so instantly and deeply. I was with such an amazing group of people, and none of those fears ended up coming to fruition at all. It was the opposite. I felt so instantly loved and accepted by these people, who I also came to really love. I made it to the top 4. And Quebec Celebrity Big Brother is a bit longer. So the season is 13 weeks and I made it like 12 and a half weeks. So I was there a really long time.
Wow.
And it's not so much what I learned, but I underwent this transformation that really became clear to me by the end, where I felt this freedom to just be myself that I don't think I had ever truly felt before. I'm such a self-protective person, like as a result of the traumas that I experienced as a kid. Again, going back to that invisibility, I built so many walls around myself in the name of protecting myself. But when you no longer need that protection, you don't need those walls anymore. But they are so hard to tear down. Like it
Mm-hmm.
is so hard to take down and dismantle those defense mechanisms that we put in place out of a necessity for survival, but at a certain point no longer serve you anymore. And the experience of Big Brother just opened me up. It really tore down a lot of those walls that I had built around myself. And I felt this freedom to just be that was so powerful. And I left the Big Brother house with this openness that I was not expecting to find in this crazy reality TV experience. Like, I really was transformed in that sense.
Oh, yeah. Reality TV can really break you down. And if you're open to it, then it sets you free. I think as long as you have that mindset where you're like, let this experience be what it is and let me grow no matter what is handed to me.
Exactly that. But I didn't even think about that going in, because going in, I was so attached to my walls. Like
Mm-hmm.
going in, I was like, how will I be able to protect myself through this experience, you know? But just very naturally, like you said, it does tear things down, but it sort of frees you and builds you up in a different way. And it's not like I became a different person. And the person that I felt now free to be is the person that I've always been, and is the person that I am with my friends. But it's sort of like in my life, I only truly come alive when I feel safe. But
Mm-hmm.
Big Brother taught me that I can be just as alive and just as much myself without necessarily feeling 100% safe. I can take up that space. That's
Mm-hmm.
what it taught me, is that like I deserve to take up space in this world.
And in some ways, you are what keeps yourself safe. So as long as you
Yes,
have you, you're
exactly.
fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you found that your time on reality TV has influenced your art at all?
A little bit, but only in the sense that I like to poke fun at it,
Mm-hmm.
So, like, as you pointed out, I did it 2 years ago. And, in Quebec, as you pointed out, is really its own sort of industry and star system. And even though we are a small province, you still have a lot of people watching, So, like,
Mm-hmm.
Big Brother here, is watched on average by like almost 1 million people every week. That's an enormous
Mm-hmm.
audience. Even some like niche HBO shows don't actually get that many viewers. So when I left the house, and again, because I'd been there for so long, people really got attached to me, and really got a sense of who I am because they got to know me for so long. So when I got out of the house, like there was this sort of kind of fame that I
Mm-hmm.
had never experienced before. Like going to the grocery store the first time after that experience, like people were stopping me and like wanting to take pictures. And I'm like, this is what I've like fantasized about my whole life, just because I'm so drawn to celebrity culture. And like, I take it with a grain of salt and I sort of experience it a little bit ironically. But so like I like to joke about that, So
Yeah.
like I think that's something that I've really brought into my comedy material, is this idea of the reality TV star, And so like 2 years ago, after that experience, I was making all of these jokes, ironically, about this newfound fame that isn't even really fame, and just sort of poking fun at it. And now, 2 years later, I'm making fun of the fact that I'm like already a has-been and everyone has already forgot. No one cares anymore. So I draw on that experience for sure in my comedy. And again, I just like to poke fun at it and like poke fun at myself for having had this ridiculous experience.
Well, I wouldn't call you a has-been because I know you have some projects on the go now. Can you share what you're working on now?
Yeah, so my big project right now actually ties in directly to the Quebec star system. So I'm starting a new podcast called Les Divas, the Divas, where I'm interviewing Quebec's biggest female icons. Because again, I'm just so pop culture obsessed, and I'm very fascinated by the idea of fame and the relationship that exists between performer and audience. And I'm doing it as a kind of limited series because I really want each episode to feel really special. I want every episode to sort of feel like an event upon itself. So I'm recording each episode with a live audience. And right now I'm sort of calling it volume 1. So we have 5 episodes lined up. We did our first one last week with Mitsu, who is kind of like Quebec's Madonna in a very different way, but just like our most fabulous, gorgeous, glam pop icon. And it went so well. Like, it was just such a magical night. And I can't predict it for sure, but I do suspect that each one of these nights is really going to be a really unique experience. We're doing it in a really intimate space. There's only 40 people in the audience each show. Like, that's the capacity. It's a really small venue. And I think it also offers the audience to have this up close and personal experience with like their favorite singers and artists. So I'm just like super pumped about it.
That sounds amazing. And if anybody wants to keep up with you and all the projects you have on the go, where can they do that?
So I'm primarily on Instagram at Tranna Wintour and, Facebook too. The Divas podcast will be available on all platforms shortly. Right now, we're just recording them and we'll be releasing them soon after. TikTok as well. I dabble in TikTok. But like everyone, I'm on all the platforms. Very easy to find.
Amazing. Tranna, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I can't wait to see what you do next. And honestly, I know your star is going to keep shining. So I will be cheering for you.
Thank you so much, Erika. This was seriously so much fun. And you're genuinely so amazing and so lovely to talk to.
I know it's just a matter of time until Tranna is firmly part of the Quebec star system. But thank you so much, Tranna, for chatting with me today. I cannot wait to see your star continue to rise. I love to end each episode by answering a listener question. But today, I am sharing some listener answers to one of my questions. When I released the Kathleen Cameron episode, that was episode 56 a few weeks ago, it was the episode about manifestation. I asked people what they had manifested, and it's so cute seeing everybody's answers, so I want to share some of them with you now. Somebody said, my wife. I wrote down my dream life, and 2 weeks later, I met my dream girl. I'm so happy that worked out for you. There are also people out there who have manifested jobs. So one person said, finding a job immediately after moving to Vancouver at the beginning of the pandemic. Lots of people have manifested concert tickets. So there were a few Eras Tour tickets. There were some K-pop concerts. And honestly, concert tickets are so competitive now. So I feel like you do need that extra little manifestation power to get them. And then I also had lots of people saying that they've manifested lots of things. I've seen people say too much, too many to count, so many things, every minute of every day. And I'm happy to see that people are getting the things that they want. And honestly, the reason why I wanted to share this is because it's so exciting and it's such a nice thing for me to hear that listeners to this podcast are making their dreams come true. So I hope that if you are listening, all of your dreams come true too. And having you listen to the show is a dream come true for me. So thank you. And if you haven't already, it would make my dream come true if you could subscribe, rate, or review this podcast wherever you get your podcast. We are also on YouTube and on Instagram. It's at Happy to See Me Pod. And a dream come true would be if you could share this episode with someone who you think would enjoy it. Thank you so much for spending time with me this week, and I will be happy to see you next Monday.